My becoming was catalyzed by grappling with the idea of perfectionism and the concept of letting people down. Ironically, these concepts arrived in my life at a point that, for all intents and purposes, I was a disappointment and a failure. I think a lot of the time when we talk about perfectionism, we think of really orderly, academic, type A people. You can probably call one to mind. When my therapist recommended me a few books, which I'll include at the end of this video, about perfectionism, about disappointing people, I literally laughed. I was experiencing homelessness. I was making really impulsive decisions. I couldn't hold a job. I was in really chaotic relationships. I was like, perfectionism is not a part of this soup, right? I am a failure. I am a high school dropout. I am a mess. But because I like to read, I sort of followed the process anyway. And I started to look at the way that I was engaging with the world through a very different lens. I realized that from a very early age in my life, I had the word lazy attached to me from my upbringing, and it ultimately became something that I kind of saw in myself. I would smash an interview, or I would have the most interesting conversation with somebody and then perform really well, maybe for the first weeks of that job or for the first months of that friendship, and then something would ultimately go wrong and I would ghost or no call or no show, or something would blow up in my face. When this would happen, I would just flee the scene. There was no conflict resolution to me. I would move on, I would try again somewhere else, and I would just keep it pushing. And this was a cycle that I lived in for many, many years of my late teens and early 20s. I developed this really deep distrust of myself overall. I didn't trust my decision making. I didn't trust my body. I didn't trust my wants, my needs. I didn't trust myself to keep myself safe at all. And this really affected my self-esteem and my overall sense of self-worth. What I realized when I was exploring deeply and reading deeply into these ideas of perfectionism and of fear of disappointing people is that avoidance and self-sabotage are very much a part of that soup. I wasn't going back to clarify my no-show because maybe I missed a bus or I made a bad decision, because I already felt so worthless and so afraid of failure, and that version of me didn't align with the person that I had shown in the beginning that was so on it, that was so on point. I couldn't stand the idea that those identities didn't reconcile. I couldn't hold the humiliation of letting someone down, of being seen or as diminished in someone else's eyes. I also really struggled with truth-telling in this period because I couldn't tolerate the loss of control that would come with explaining to people my situation, especially when it was so radically different than that of my peers or the people that I was spending time with or even working with. And so even though on the surface my life seemed the opposite of what a perfectionist life would be, the opposite of what a people pleaser's life would be, the opposite of what a sort of high-performing person's life was, the level of shame and the level of avoidance that I was kind of engaging in at that time was very much lined up with these belief systems around productivity, around my self-worth, and around my inability to kind of reconcile my imperfection with the reality that my life was kind of a mess. It was also incredibly punishing around my decision making at this time. I ended up in a lot of really bad relationships. I ended up in a lot of various stages of just burnout. I couldn't pick up phone calls. I still struggle with this. I couldn't be in touch with people. I couldn't manage life. It felt like on a constant basis, life was unfolding at a rate that was just way too fast for me. I also really struggled with my image of myself. I often saw myself as a child or a teenager in my own mind. I never felt grown up in the ways that the people around me were grown up. I never felt enough. I always kind of had this sense of imposter syndrome. And so when I was able to obtain some sort of stability in my life, even what would objectively maybe on the surface more look like traditional ideas of success, I still had all of these issues. I still had all of this avoidance. I still was really late to things, or would easily get overwhelmed and drop out of projects that I was working on, drop off teams, or drop off the planet entirely from my friend groups. And I realized after doing a lot of work with my therapist and a lot of work around these topics that my brain during this period of my life was actually working super extra double overtime to keep me alive. And so there wasn't enough energy left to manage this shame around the imperfection, to manage conflicts, to sort of keep all of these different priorities of okay, joy, okay, community, okay, job, money, all of these things afloat while my existential needs weren't being met on a consistent basis while I was in really chaotic situations, right? My brain was in survival mode. So when I started to honor this need for rest, when I started to separate myself from the way that I thought that people were perceiving me, the way that I thought that I had to be in the world in order to be worthy, all of these other things began to come apart for me too. I began to communicate more clearly about my body's need for rest and various things that were going on with my body. I found out that I had autism, that I had several immune disorders, that I had endometriosis, all of these things that I had sort of learned how to manage myself, internalized, and ultimately ignored because it fed into that sense of general wrongness and imperfection that I didn't have the stamina to deal with at the time. And this also started the kind of larger process of like identity deconstruction, of understanding if I can say no to a job I don't want to do, if I can say no to being spoken to or treated in a way that I don't want to, maybe there's other things that I don't want either, whether it's the way that I'm expected to perform my gender, the way that I'm expected to express myself or access love and community. Suddenly I was able to start pruning away at all of these things that I had, all of these kind of plates that I had been trying to spin, and I started to understand the shape of myself, my own identity underneath all these things. Like when you cut away all that performance, when you cut away all those shoulds and all those expectations and all that shame and all that pressure, all that's left at the end is you. And this is obviously a very terrifying place to arrive to, and I think it's terrifying to me every time I'm able to arrive to it, even now, right? We all have those feelings of shame, of self-loathing, of wishing we were different or better. So then the work became about how to sort of stay close to myself when I could arrive to that authenticity, when I could work up the courage to embody the person that I am and accept the consequences that come with that, accept that some people may not like me, some people may not understand me, that I will take some losses in my life as a result of embodying my true self, the self that I am now and the person that I aspire to be every day. The closer I became to myself, the farther I became from other people in my life too. It definitely caused a lot of friction that I still deal with around my family dynamics. I lost a lot of friends, and I definitely internalized that at various points too. Like the process isn't linear, right? It's definitely all kinds of twists and turns, but getting comfortable with grieving the loss of things that I had maintained for so long, right? I had taken care of these things. I had made sure those plates were spinning. I had kept the parts of me concealed so that I could kind of have all these things, realizing that what I was gaining by getting in alignment with myself, by becoming myself and getting to know myself and staying near to myself, actually was infinitely more fulfilling and brought me closer to other things that I wanted way more than the things that were taking all of that energy from me. I was creating way different types of art, way different types of relationships, having different types of conversations, feeling safer to try new things, right? Because I trusted myself to be able to set boundaries, to communicate clearly, to recognize my sensory needs, to recognize my discomfort, and to not sort of blur all of the lines of my boundaries and force myself to take on this identity of perpetually okay. I think too in our culture we have this idea of becoming as a destination, and I think it's one of the most brutal and unkind things that we do to ourselves and each other. Something I say a lot is the most pain, the most suffering in our lives exists in this thing I call the during. It's the place between recognizing that you want something to be different and having it change. And something I've started to explore the idea of myself kind of loosely through journaling, but is becoming something that is really built into my value system more and more every day, is this idea that it is not my job to become anything. I am not supposed to make something of myself. I am supposed to be able to occupy with intentionality and direction the state of becoming for as long as I possibly can and keep experimenting with myself as I have the time to on this planet. I can't fall out of Jamila in the same way that I can't fall into Jamila. I can do things that are more in alignment with my idea of integrity, with my ideas of belonging, with what I'm seeking in terms of making being myself easier in the world or less painful in the world or more joyful. But I can't lose myself. I can't lose myself in a relationship. I can't lose myself in a job. But I can pay attention to myself and align more with myself that's already in here. I don't know if that makes sense. And it sounds kind of just like a silly, whooshy thing to talk about, but in terms of how it's affected my day-to-day life, it's given me so much more capacity for self-forgiveness, so much more awareness of other people and where they are, and it's taken off this pressure that at any given moment I'm either closer or farther away from what I'm supposed to be. Every second that I'm here, every second that I exist on this planet, I'm fulfilling the job of being Jamila. I'm already what I'm supposed to be all the time, and I have the right to play in it, to enjoy it, and to be intentional with it in the same way that I would want my relationships to treat me, in the same way that I would want to treat others.